Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for your patience with the technical challenges we are experiencing. My name is Sonia Gandert, and I am the Associate Director of Research Initiatives at the US Latinx Art Forum. You saw that Babia Collective, the interpretation group, is doing interpretation for our Zoom audience, but I did also want to mention that for those of us in person at the Whitney, if you would like to listen to the interpretation, there are listening devices in the back of the theater. I would like to acknowledge that here at the Whitney Museum, we are on the lands of the Lenape people. As a result of centuries of colonialism, today the Lenape are dispersed throughout the US and Canada. Alongside the Lenape, many other indigenous nations have ancestral ties to the place now known as New York, including the 6 Haudenosaunee nations, Seneca, Cayuga, Tuscarora, Mohawk, Oneida, and Onondaga, as well as the Shinnecock and the Puspatuk. We honor their ongoing connections to this place. If you are joining us online, please take a moment to identify and recognize the indigenous people who have always and continue to steward the land from which you're joining us. The US Latinx Art Forum champions artists and arts professionals through initiatives that advance the vitality of Latinx art and foster an intergenerational network that spans academia, arts institutions, and collections. In 2021, we launched the Latinx Artist Fellowship. The fellowship awards $50,000 in unrestricted funds to each member of a multi-generational cohort of 15 visual artists each year for an initial commitment of 5 years. It is the first significant prize of its kind and celebrates the plurality and diversity of Latinx artists and aesthetics. It is designed to address the systemic and long-standing lack of philanthropic and institutional support for Latinx artists, and we are honored to be a partner for this groundbreaking initiative. As a complement to our fellowship program, last year we launched the X's Intersection, Writing on Latinx Art, a digital publishing initiative that convenes a distinguished editorial board to curate thematic collections of short-form essays on the work of Latinx Artist Fellowship recipients. To read more about the initiative and learn how to submit to the current call, Diasporic Untethering, curated by Karen Mary Davalos, please visit our website, uzlof.org. The deadline for submissions is April 4th. 2025 also marks the 10th anniversary of USLOF's founding, and we are thrilled to celebrate a decade of programming and initiatives that have fostered a dynamic community of artists and interlocutors. It is now my pleasure to welcome you to X's Intersection, Seeing Untold Stories. This series gathers our 4th cohort of fellows into conversation with curators and members of USLOF's executive committee who all share a sustained commitment to Latinx art. It is now my pleasure to introduce our co-moderators for the conversation, Marcela Guerrero, DiMartini Family Curator, Whitney Museum of American Art, and Adriana Zavala, Executive Director of the US Latinx Art Forum.
Thank you, Sonia. Hello, everyone, and good afternoon. It's really wonderful to look out and see so many familiar faces and so many new faces. We're really grateful to you for coming, for sharing this beautiful New York afternoon with us here at the Whitney. It's an honor and a genuine pleasure to be here at the Whitney Museum of American Art for the US Latinx Art Forum's first hybrid program in its ongoing X's Intersection Conversation on Latinx Art series. As Sonia noted, this is the 4th year in the series, which until this afternoon has been presented entirely online. Today, in Seeing Untold Stories, we bring together 3 incredible artists. Lizania Cruz and Jenelle Esparza are here with us in person, and Pepón Osorio is with us online via Zoom. As we will learn, each of these artists creates installations that activate objects and materials in unique and special ways in order to bring forth untold stories. The stories they engage are at times personal. At others, they are stories that were shared with the artists by individuals or communities. But in any case, these artists' materially provocative approaches invite us to think beyond ourselves, to listen to others, and to find the connections that we share across our differences. So let me offer a very brief introduction to the artists. Lizania Cruz is a Dominican participatory artist and designer interested in how migration affects ways of being and belonging. Through research, oral history, and audience engagement, she creates projects that expand and share pluralistic narratives on migration. Jenelle Esparza is an interdisciplinary artist who was born in the coastal city of Corpus Christi, Texas, and who currently lives and works in San Antonio. Janelle's work examines the lesser-known history of cotton and labor in South Texas. Her recent projects utilize textiles and found objects to explore the parallels between landscape and bodily experiences and the implications of generational trauma. And last but not least, Pepón Osorio merges conceptual art and community dynamics through large-scale installations that emphasize the exhibition space as an intermediary between the social architecture of communities and the mainstream art world. For almost 3 decades, Pepón Osorio has been presenting work in unconventional places prior to exhibiting them in museum settings, thus exploring the subjectivity of meaning in art and the multiple meanings that these installations achieve, depending on their location.
Thank you, Adriana. So, to fully understand the rich practice of each of these artists would require hours of conversations and close observation of their works. That is not what we're going to do here today. Instead, the purpose of today's panel is to look at one specific angle of their practice and to spark the interest in you to learn more. With that said, let me give you an overview of what's going to happen this afternoon. Each artist will have 20-ish minutes to present a project that responds to the following questions. How do objects become evidence of the stories you want to tell? How do you amplify conceptually and materially those stories through art? Where do you see yourself in these stories, in these narratives? Where do you place yourself? After each presentation, we will leave space for questions and cross-talk from the panelists and us, the moderators. If you have seen previous X as intersection panels, you know that the exchange that happens, especially between the artists, is the hallmark of these talks. This is a unique opportunity for artists to be, and I quote, in community of interest, activity, feeling, or experience, end of quote. This is a true definition of a fellowship, and to explore the points of contact between them. We have reserved a few minutes at the end for questions from the audience. We encourage questions, provocations, and any other way you want to express generosity toward the artists or the themes here discussed. While the ideas articulated this evening will undoubtedly be personal and profound, as Adriana said, we welcome a casual atmosphere where curiosity prevails. And so with that, I'm going to turn it to Lizania to tell us about participation and the stories in her work.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Marcela, Adriana, and Mary, and the uplifts team. It's really an honor to be in conversation today with 2 amazing artists that I deeply admire, Janelle and Pepón, and to share a little bit, kind of like a section about my work. So to start off, I'll say that I work on long-term research projects that use participatory methods to bring different voices into the work. And I'm very interested in pushing against hegemonic narratives that permeate the public sphere to kind of create a sense of who belongs and who doesn't. And I hope that the bodies of work that I create provide visual counter-narratives for a more pluralistic space. I listen a lot in my work. I think listening and community are a central part to my practice. I listen to people on the streets. I create story circles to kind of like be in connection with different stories. I listen to what's inscribed in the archive, national and personal. And most recently, I've been interested in how the past have been silenced in order to maintain a specific ideology specifically in the Dominican Republic, where, the past has been silent and historicized in a way where they have erased and suppressed our African heritage, therefore creating a sense of otherness towards Blackness and a sense of xenophobia towards our Haitian brothers and sisters. So this is particularly important, not only in the Dominican Republic, but globally, because, for instance, in 2013, the Dominican Republic passed a law that's best known as La Sentencia, that denationalized, actually revokes citizenship retroactively to some statistics go between numbers, but it says that around 200,000 Dominicans of Haitian descent have become stateless. So they can go to Haiti, and they don't have any rights in the Dominican Republic. So for instance, this installation is based on my latest body of work I'll be sharing with you, which is titled The Investigation of the Dominican Racial Imaginary. Is a really mouthful. But for this body of work, I'm really using the aesthetics and the language of a bureaucratic department that is looking into the crime that has been instated in our Dominican consciousness. So for instance, this installation is titled The Plaintiff's Records, and is specifically looking at La Sentencia, is a series of book sculptures that it's an edition of 20 books, and each book has 10,000 pages, and each page is representative to one of the birth certificates that have been revoked to the Dominicans of Haitian descent. And for this installation in particularly, I collaborated with a group in the Dominican Republic called Reconocido, who is fighting for the rights of this community. And they created a writing workshop so those folks could tell their stories from the I perspective. So in half of the book throughout the installation, you could scan a QR code and then go into and read one of the stories from the perspective of the person who has been actually affected by this law. And as I mentioned as well, I often go into the streets. I think I thrive for my work to not be in an institutional space only, but to really activate the public space. And I do a lot of actions that then are kind of shown in the gallery space as documentation or as like the remains of the paperwork that I've collected. And these are two documentations of two different actions. The one on the right, this is hard, but there's an action in Sevilla when I was researching in the al Archivo de las Indias, and I've been interested in the narrative around where the remains of Christopher Columbus are. In the Dominican Republic, we have a very awful looking monument that it was erected as kind of like the 500-year anniversary of colonization in the island, and the Dominican Republic says that the Christopher Columbus remains are there, but Spain says that his remains are in Sevilla. So I went to Sevilla to actually ask people around the cathedral where do they think the remains of Christopher Columbus are, because we actually don't know. There's like, in the form that I'm asking people, there's Cuba, Cadiz, Santo Domingo, Sevilla. People were telling me like the most random places too. So it kind of reiterates this idea that this narrative has been installed in us without really questioning. And then the other action was an action I did in the Dominican Republic in Santo Domingo, where I asked people, based on the work of sociologist Fradique Lizardo, which I highly recommend checking him out. He has a book titled African Culture in Santo Domingo, and he has a diagram of miscegenation according to the different kind of like stages of colonization. And so I asked people how they identify themselves racially and how they've been identified. So in the Dominican Republic, we still, until recently, we had no category of race in the census. So I was interested in kind of like collecting this data and information. And as I move through this body of work, I'm also interested in what makes something legitimate, what makes something kind of like credible to sort of like the narratives that have been sort of cemented in history. So I'm kind of employing sort of the materials and again, the aesthetics of what bureaucracy looks like. So this is an installation I just did recently, well, 2 years ago. Sounds crazy. But for a solo show I had at Proxico here in New York. And I silk screened, there's like a series of 74 boxes, and each box represent a city that I've been in, part of my research, either that I've like gone to their archives or that are part of the investigation. And then I'll end by showing this public activation I did for the biennial in the Dominican Republic at the Centro León in 2020. And I did an intervention in the north side of the Dominican Republic where I had 8 questions and around 300 of these posters around the city where I was looking for witnesses, literally, and asking people the question of, what do you believe is the true story of Christopher Columbus that you learned in school? You know, do you know that el mango is like a very traditional Dominican food that we have for breakfast or wherever the occasion mandates? Do you know that this food was actually popularized by enslaved folks in the Dominican Republic? And then there was like a phone number, and this was in the middle of the pandemic, so I also had to kind of like rethink how my practice moved in the world. So I was interviewing people on WhatsApp, and I interview around 80 people, and then I created a repository of all the responses and interviews that when you go to the gallery space, you could actually see the digital aspect of this. And it was really great because I did it through WhatsApp, and there was like an audio component that I didn't expect that I was able to accomplish still being during the pandemic. So that's a little bit about my work. Thank you.
Before we move on to Janelle, I have more comments and questions. I think what's fascinating, and I'm curious to know what others here think. I find it fascinating that you take things that perhaps are not even that have been taken for granted. It's just things we don't question. Like, you know, Christopher Columbus, sure, yeah, he died, but where? Or what does that say about, you know, especially so many of the Latin American countries that were colonized by Spain, or even mango, or, you know, to plug in another project you didn't talk about this time, but I encourage you to Google, or you might remember from La Trienal a couple of years ago, Obituaries of the American Dream, where right is the American Dream. We know what it is. We never question it, but you pose the question by looking at it from another angle, like, no, it died. When did it die for you? And then kind of crowdsourcing those answers. And then, so it's super interesting how, you know, something that we kind of, it as you said before, you know, a past that has been silenced, that doesn't exist, the voices of the people don't exist in the archive, and you're giving them a voice. You're going from the individuals to the collective. And also the ways in which you're doing this through so many different tactics and strategies of asking, surveying, you know, that kind of, you know, questionnaire kind of thing, WhatsApp. For the obituaries, I think people could use a website. It's just really cool how you're thinking about all these different ways to collect stories.
Yeah, I think that that's like a challenge usually, and it's something that I'm always thinking of, like how do I intervene in the public and in a way that creates inquiry instead of sort of pointing out the thing that we should look differently. I think I'm always trying to figure out the way in which I bring people along to the question rather than posing answers. And yeah, I honestly, I think that because I'm trained as a designer, I'm always thinking of like the marketing tools that are available to reach audiences. So I use those in my practice because that's the thing I know. And then how do that gets translated into the gallery per se.
Do we have time for another intervention? So I want to pick up on something Marcela commented about, which is the archive. Right, because so many of us, again, there's a common sense understanding that archives are hallowed, unquestioned repositories of history, of knowledge, of a people, but they're actually very often arbitrary, right? It's what survived, it's what was presented in a judicial occurrence, and very often entire communities are silenced in the archive. So I'm curious about, you're creating archives here, and from my perspective, they're as legitimate as almost any other archive. So I'm curious about that.
Yeah, I was researching, to kind of answer your question, I was researching the Historical Society of Philadelphia, because I am also very interested in Frederick Douglass, as I also did another installation about Frederick Douglass. And in the Historical Society in Philly, I realized that enslaved people their archives are part of their slave master, not even their own their own archive per se. So that always kind of shocked me, how the voices of the people are sort of taken away from the archive. So specifically with this body of work, the investigation, I am very aware of how this is going to be archived, where is it going to be archived, and who could access. Because again, I'm really thinking of these as like material evidence of a thing that I'm pushing against. So I think a lot about that, of how do I create consent with the voices that I'm trying to bring into the work, and how do I create this repository that it really can. I want the work to not be just this object. I want it to kind of like go in different places. So yeah, I think it's important.
Should we move on? Okay, Janelle.
Awesome. Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much, Lizania. Awesome, lovely, yes. Lovely learning about your work. And it's such an honor to be here. Thank you, US Whitney, and everybody involved. This is awesome. So I just want to share. Oh, I have the clicker, don't I? My name is Jenelle Esparza, and I just kind of want to share a little bit about my work. It really starts off and focuses on the cotton fields in South Texas, which kind of seems like a faraway place from all the way over here in New York. But it expands into these much broader histories. I feel like the cotton fields specifically, connect families, connect histories, and also connect the body to the landscape in a really specific way. It's kind of this place where all of these things converge for me. And through learning about my family's own agricultural history, it expanded into the fact that this was the experience of many other Tejano families that are connected to the same experiences. And then that led to kind of this unpacking of much larger Texas histories, like traumatic histories, violent histories, that like state-sanctioned violence and hostile land theft against Tejanos at the turn of the century. And it really wasn't that long ago when you think about it. And coming from a family that's got, several generations in Texas, probably since before it was Texas, it is, really interesting to me. And so it was sort of like purposeful for me to move into that space conceptually. I feel like like our stories and our experiences are very much tied into these fields, tied into these landscapes. And it's not a history that we learn about in school, but we're surrounded by it constantly. Like the stories are just, they're lingering there around us. We hear little whispers of them. So when I really started to like peel back the layers of this research and ask my family directly, it was really enlightening to hear these details from their perspective. Like my grandma's telling me about her experience picking in the fields. She's from this generation that doesn't talk about things. So I think it also became this healing space for people to share about their direct experiences. So on the first slide here, this was a project funded by the National Association of Latino Arts and Culture, otherwise known as NALAC. And this was sort of this culmination of all of this research that I had done with my family and also with cotton. And I knew that I wanted this large-scale mural photo of a cotton field in full bloom for this exhibition because it demonstrated sort of the vastness of this history and all the interconnectedness of it. I was learning about all these different spaces, and it just showed it on this massive scale. And so when you first walked into the gallery, it was the very first thing that you saw when you walked up in there. And I want to share a little story about when I took this photograph. We were driving through South Texas, me and my partner Rigo, who's usually my sidekick on these little journeys. And we got access to this field, to this private property, to photograph this. And on the way there, we're surrounded by cotton fields all the way around us, which is pretty typical of the region. And we drove through a little town called Robstown. And the high school has a huge mural on the side that just says, "Home of the Cotton Pickers." And I love that they, this high school and this community had chosen the cotton picker as their mascot because of the strength and because of the pride. And it just sort of really highlighted the identity of the region and the importance of these histories. So I just wanted to share that because I thought it was kind of cool. And this was also the first time that I was able to stand in the middle of these fields because I usually don't want to just roll up on people's private property in Texas. So I'm really glad that please don't do it. I don't recommend it. It's scary, but I did get access. I got permission to go into this field, and it was the first time that I was able to stand in the middle of it and see the field and see it from that angle, the same angle that my relatives had seen it from, which is so far removed from my generation, but also that experience wasn't really that far back. So it was really powerful experience there. And so the focus of this exhibition in terms of objects and how they inform the work was the plant. So not only was it this 10 by 25 foot mural, but in the upper right-hand corner, you can see this bronze cotton spur. And it's basically the part of the plant, when you remove the fiber from it, you're left with this little kind of star shape. And they call it a spur because I guess it kind of resembles like a boot spur. It's round and it's spiky and sharp. And I remember my grandma sharing how this was the most painful part of the plant when you're picking it because those little ends when the plant dies are very, very sharp. You can kind of see how minute the ends are there. And I wanted to kind of like commemorate that history in a really positive way instead of highlighting this negativity or this really like awful traumatic experience. I wanted to commemorate the sacrifice and sort of, that aspect of it. And so I chose bronze for the material here because it felt appropriate, and I'm not a sculptor. My background is in photography, hence the giant photo. But this is really where my work started to shift in materials and become more object-based. And so I learned I learned the lost wax casting method and was able to cast these little pieces of plant in bronze, and then I put them in these infinity mirror boxes. So on the bottom right image, they're really small, but inside there was 1 or 2 pieces of bronze, and then they were viewed through double-sided mirror. So it created this like infinity reflection. So in each little bitty box, you could see this infinite kind of row of cotton. So it was like this generational lineage, you know, reflected from this one little object. And I also thought, you know, they look like little stars when you cast them in bronze. They're sparkly, they're gold, they're shiny. And it just kind of transformed this painful history into something really beautiful that we can hold on to, that we can grasp. And also the lost wax casting method is very labor intensive, and it was the first time that I had kind of incorporated my own labor into the work, and that kind of continues throughout that. So then I started utilizing the cotton fiber, so not just the plant matter itself, but also the fiber. And I kind of continued to delve into this cotton history, and this is the first time that I utilized the cotton fiber for the first time. For this exhibition, this was for a residency at Art Pace in San Antonio. And I really wanted to focus on the bodily experiences of labor, and also like the generational relationship to labor, and also the generational trauma that the body experiences as descendants of this type of work. It was really important for me to keep my own labor as a part of the conceptual process, so learning to weave kind of just made the most sense. And it was kind of a way to bring the two things, the cotton aspect and the labor aspect, together. So once I knew that I wanted to weave for this residency, I took a weaving class. I purchased a loom from the school. I still use that loom today, and I practiced for about a year, just trying to get my brain around the process before the residency started. And so these large weavings that you're seeing here on the slide, these are the first ones that I was able to create. And it kind of just kicked off this much larger journey into weaving, into cotton history, and sort of the transformation of the human experience, and transforming the form, the human form, abstracting it, really. The patterns really came from this familiarity with anatomy growing up. I come from a long line of nurses and a couple paramedics, so there were tons of like anatomy books around my house, and I would absorb all of the illustrations of like muscular systems and connective tissues, and a lot of these older medical books were like hand-drawn illustrations for medical purposes. So I was really drawn to that aspect of it as well, because my father was an illustrator. But I was really familiar with that part of the body, like the body on that medical level. And so it kind of informed the patterns that I created here. So in the middle, the tapestry that's in the center, it's called seep. And I wanted it to represent like a wound. So you have this huge, it's probably about 8.5, 9 feet tall. With all of that yarn, it's very heavy. So once I put it up on the wall, I had the warp strings kind of dangling down onto the floor. And then inlaid through the surface is this like metallic red yarn. And I wanted it to really kind of hang there and drag and feel painful, because that's sort of representation, or like an abstraction of the infliction of this trauma on the body. And so, but seeing it on the wall for the first time, it was the first finished piece that I made at the residency. And once I put it on the wall, it was kind of shocking, because it was just this huge wound on the wall. And I was like, we're not just victims of this experience, we survived something. It was very traumatic to have this wound. So the patterns that are flanking it were kind of created in response to that, to kind of counteract the pain and talk about the healing. So they kind of represent scar tissue, this healing over of flesh and wounds. And then if you can notice, there's also little blue globular shapes in the pattern that represent blood platelets. And blood platelets are the body's first responders to trauma and injury in the body. So I used this Japanese blue silk to represent that shape. And then that blue paint became the healing color throughout the exhibition because it contrasted so well with like the monochrome of the natural brown, the natural white. So I painted the walls and the pedestals blue to kind of talk about the trauma, but also like still have the healing aspect of it, so it's not too shocking. You know, I want to portray the resilience of the experience as well. You know. And then the last slide here is sort of like, so weaving really, it was the first time that I was able to abstract the human form, and it really allowed me to connect the body to the landscape directly. And by using cotton, by keeping cotton the through line in the work, it was pretty pivotal. You know, I was reading the writings of Dr. Amalia Mesa Baines, and she references this term called the human geography. And what she means by that, or at least what I interpreted, was, you know, there's these two planes. You have the body, and then you have the landscape, the earth. And they kind of exist on these parallel planes where they record histories, they are witness to histories, and therefore they're kind of holders and keepers of histories at the same time. And yet they're two completely different entities. And I feel like weaving was kind of the first way for me to portray that. So weaving just kind of became my main medium, my main process. I was so drawn to it because it was the first time I was able to kind of break through the work in that way. And so I continued, and so now I continue to weave. But through that transformation, it was sort of like I was able to see objects a little bit differently. I kind of arrived at weaving to demonstrate this concept of the body-land connection, and now, you know, I'm incorporating this entire history of fiber and cloth along with this connection to the body. And so, you know, understanding that thread work is a global material. It predates written language. It predates alphabets and inscriptions. And you know, Annie Albers describes it as the first transmitter of meaning, and that just really like stuck with me because I was like, yes, you know, fiber is it. It's ancestral. It's ancient, and so cool. Like an early communicator before cave drawings and all that. So yeah, I felt like I was creating my own visual language with fiber. And then I started kind of incorporating objects because I started to utilize these tools. A lot of the tools in this image is like a skith, and there's like pitchforks and stuff. Some of those belong to my great-grandparents that were used to work the land. And they started to, through all of this like body abstracting the human experience, I started to see these objects a little bit differently. They started to take on these very human-like forms and shapes. So I started to see objects completely differently. Not only did I use the objects, you know, the family heirlooms, the tools that my great-grandparents used, but also I was picking up more tools, more objects from flea markets, from, you know, yard sales, the pulga. I go to the pulga a lot. And then I started pairing them, and it was making this completely different visual language and creating this sort of abstracted narrative on the wall that had all these different histories, that had Texas histories, you know, taking on these new forms. Some of these shapes started to look like torsos, some of them started to look like organs, and then kind of paired with the hand-woven weavings and the Texas-grown cotton, just really started to create a very unique visual language for me. And then it was like me building up these larger narratives. There's the violent histories, there's rifles, there's like lots of sharp objects, and they're intimidating, but they're also kind of softened by some of this fiber. And so I called it the family room, this specific installation, because it was more of a collective narrative. It was the ancestral narrative, the global narrative of the cotton. My own personal narrative is in here somewhere, and just overall family experiences.
Thank you, Janelle.
Yeah.
I knew there would be applauses, so I made a pause. We're gonna move soon to Pepón, but I don't know if this is my own personal ignorance, but the history of Tejanos in cotton is I don't know how widely known that is, or I feel like you're talking about textiles as communicators. That's you're filling in that, as Adriana was saying before, kind of that gap in history. And I don't know if you can recall that moment when you heard these stories. You were like, where are we in the history books when we talk about cotton?
That definitely happened somewhere along the way, because we knew, I knew the story with my grandparents, but I don't think I had really connected it, because we're not taught in school that this was everybody. This was my classmates and the people that I engage with, that I went to school with, that I work with, all, in the majority Latino region that I live in. This was everybody's history. And so once I really understood that it all kind of came through these fields and kind of culminated in this really remarkable setting, it just took off from there.
How are we doing for time? Again, I'm pulling the threads of the connections, but you're creating a very different kind of archive here. But one of the things that really struck me is that it was fascinating to hear you talk about in the prior work the textiles as informed by your understanding of anatomy, because as I was looking, and this is the beauty of abstraction, and your work is quite abstract, right? I was thinking back to the mural of the cotton field and also thinking about the infinity boxes, and that's what I was seeing in the pattern of the textile. So I think that's one of the beauties of hearing an artist explicate their own work, is that we can hold what we perceived, but then it's informed by what the artist tells us. So I just sort of wanted to make that observation that it's really wonderful to hear you explain it and then hold that with the body of knowledge that I perceived in the work.
Thank you for that. That's a really great observation. Thank you.
One thing that I didn't know was the patterns and the, what are they called? Plackets? Platelets. Sorry. And the connection to, and you said that you have family who are nurses or paramedics. And that reminded me, you have, again, plugins for works that you might want to Google or do research. A work that was in a hospital, was it in San Antonio?
Yes.
Yeah. Anyway, we might not have time to talk about it today, but that connects to our next presenter, Pepón Osorio, who, and it's so fascinating to think about, how we go from listening as healing, and to presenting works out, and in the case of Pepón, outside the museum, in spaces that are loaded with other, histories and important sites. Pepón, take it away.
Hi, can you hear me?
Sorry, say that again.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you, yes. People were applauding you.
Okay. Oh, okay, because I don't see anything. So I'm like trusting that there's people out there. But I just wanted to say how nervous I am to follow Lizania Cruz and Jenelle Esparza's act. It's like, boy, I hope I make justice now. I will talk a little bit about the process and how I get to do the things that I do. And then I know what the images are, but since I'm not seeing anything on my screen, I will describe a little bit in general, not in details. But there are stories in the air waiting to be told, and sometimes I'm the conduit for some of those stories. I never seek stories. I don't go around soliciting or finding stories. I think that stories come to me. And I tell you, for this very specific piece, Convalescence, which I'm just going to show, it was presented last year. I was in a gathering, and somehow, somewhere, this guy walked in with in a walker, and sat next to me, and we had a very intense conversation. And at the end, I realized that person somehow, somewhere connected with my spirituality, my physicality, and also the emotions. And we had a really intense conversation, and then he ended up agreeing to be in the stories. And this is how stories come and how I'm able to translate them visually. Convalescence took 3 years in the making to be completed. And I collaborated with 4 families. We share stories, we share conditions, the lack of access to the medical system, and lifetime healing, and what that means. There's no surprise that convalescence to me, after I received a diagnosis, cancer diagnosis, I realized that I had all this time been telling other people's stories, and that this was my time to tell my story in relationship to others, and with other, with 4 other families. So I did. I spent the years of the pandemic going to chemotherapy, and at that time I just sat there in the room, and little by little people came to tell me the stories, and I never wanted to do anything about it until one day that I just woke up and realized that I needed to tell my story, and that it was important, not only that I tell my story, but also include other people, so then we can look at the bigger system of medical neglect. And so convalescence comes from this idea that you are in eternal convalescing. I believe that after trauma, you are eternally healing. Healing doesn't, you just don't get better overnight. And that somehow, somewhere, institutions are in a state of convalescing, individuals are in a state of convalescing. We're just basically at that place where we hope that things will get better. And that we hope that eventually we will heal, but that takes, a lifetime, as I said before. If you wanted to show, I don't know what's going on there, but I'm assuming that the
Yeah, we're
first-
moving on. We're moving the slides, and we saw
Okay.
the carrito and now the beds.
Right.
Yeah.
So how convalescence as an exhibition was, I just decided to, for the past 3 years, I have decided that I wanted to bring work into the community, which I have another story to tell later. But I wanted to bring the exhibitions to the community, to the place of origin. And in this very specific piece, because it had to do with the medical field, I wanted it to bring the installation to be seen for the first time in a hospital. And so that's exactly what happened. I was able to convince the people in Philadelphia, the medical Jefferson Hospital in Philadelphia, to allow me to put the exhibition at the lobby in a very, very large space. And so I don't produce, I'm not like a maniac when it comes to producing work. I make one work every 3 years or maybe 4 years, because I am totally wiped out by the time I finish the story. I'm completely intensely devoted to the families. I don't do anything but spend time with them and build a relationship and build a conversation with them that lasts to the real stories by the real people and the truth. So when we finished this, when I finished the entire installation, I brought it to the lobby, and I wanted to somehow create an environment that it was similar to a ward in the hospital. The exhibition, the installation had like a huge window where you can see the people outside, and the people on the outside can see the installation. And as a visitor, you coming into the space, you seeing something, but at the same time, you're looking at the medical community that is also suffering in many ways. And you see patients, and doctors came in, nurses came in, caretakers came in, and I thought that the installation, I'm never aware of this, but I mean, not that I'm never aware of it. I don't develop work with this idea in mind, but this one specifically was extremely, extremely emotional. And so I think that I spent a lot of the time consoling people while I was there at the exhibition. It starts if you have the carrito, the cart, the hamburger cart. I don't know if that's the image that it's up, but it starts with that, and then introduces you to several symptoms. In my case, I lost a lot of weight, and the most common, object to tell the story was a scale, was standing right there in front of you as you walked in, telling my stories. And then he moves on to a couple of other pieces objects that also tells their own story, but it's in relationship to symptoms. And then you walked into the installation and see a card that it was made in Puerto Rico, where they have the most critical and devastating medical uh, situation. And you walked in, and that was another story with a person that I met who used to be a cart owner. He sells hamburgers, but he was just about to retire. And I don't know, the stories, as I said before, came to me. I sat there, I started to talk to him, and suddenly he said, I'm retiring. And I can't take it anymore. I am very ill. And so I began to have a conversation, and somehow, somewhere, I owned the car. I inherited the car, and and the person that you see on that video in front, it's him. Needless to say that every work that I do, St. Lazarus, in the Yoruba religion, it's called Babalu Aye, always shows up in my work. So if you look next to the car, there is me in the position standing similar to Babalu Aye, but you also see him on the shelf of the cart. You move forward, and then you see all these PET scans, which I have never seen before. I mean, that I've never knew anything about them, and CT scans. And I began to do a research on my condition, and I looked at the CT scan, and I thought it was really important to enlarge them and to tell all the people my story through the view of my body and what that meant. And then after that, and again, I don't know what you're seeing, but after that, it began little by little to develop different beds with stories of different families. The first one is an African American woman who also came to me interested in working, and she decided that medical neglect during her birth giving, and she was in the hospital, misdiagnosed, and somehow, little by little, she was in very critical condition, lost her baby. Next to her, it's someone has problems with her kidneys, and she's on a waiting list. In Philadelphia, specifically at the hospital that she's at, the waiting list is at least 120,000 people. So you can tell how much hope and how much waiting she has to do in order to get a transplant. That moves on to another one, which is a guy who had 3 strokes and kept coming back to life. And so we have another, and that was the guy who came in with a walker into the party. And we had a lot of conversations around that. And next to him, it's me that I guess I should get personal, see something personal with everything else. I was diagnosed with prostate cancer, and I was doing okay because I kept telling the doctors who didn't know anything that there was something wrong, and then they somehow didn't realize that it was. And lucky enough, the second cancer that I got was prostate cancer at the very, very beginning. And one of the lines that I just kept saying over and over again kept telling to the doctor is that he kept talking about with this incredible, convincing, trying to be very convincing about the knowledge. And I just kept going back to him and said, I've been carrying this prostate for 70 years. How could you know more about it than me? I know more about this thing than you. But anyway, it started to be a little early stages of cancer, and it was taken care, and I'm glad. But at that point, going back again to the story, it's that the medical system somehow imposes themselves in bodies and in traumas that that they can differentiate the body and how different the body is in everybody else. So and then it goes back again at the very end. Oh, I have also at the very beginning you'll see men, large videos of men in severe pain. I met three guys who wanted to be in the work. Three guys who are in excruciating pain day by day. And so I also make the videos. The videos are on the bed. You can see them on like almost like a pillow. And then what it tells basically, it's that in hospitals, everybody goes to sleep at the same time and everybody wakes, it's awaking at the same time. And so what I wanted to do is just basically create an environment with the video where everyone was telling the story at the same time. And then at the end, synchronized, everyone was asleep at the same time. So you're going and you're somehow interrupting you know, the life and of these people, but at the same time, they're telling you their stories, and their stories is told through dreams. I'm almost done. Yeah, the wonderful thing is that I was able to use this space, as I said before, with a big window. And as you sit in there, you see people on wheelchairs running from one side to the other. My work is extremely, extremely complex. It tells many stories that are real, but I'm also telling stories as they are told to me. I never alter the stories. I never move around, you know, and tell anything that is not serious. I mean, that is not true. The wonderful thing is that you have to be part of the project to understand every single meaning of every single object that is around. The most amazing thing is that the four families, and including myself, I invited them the day of the opening to come in 3 hours before it opened to the public. And we all went to our own bases, you know, to where the pieces, the installation was. And we sat there and we all cried. We were just crying and crying. And I think that what happened was that we finally were able to visit ourselves at a hospital, and visit ourselves to a place where it was telling the story not only that we told, but it was a story also telling the story that we knew that other people will hear. And to stand there and to look in the pill bottles, the bodies of these people, and at the same time seeing them alive and see them moving throughout the installation was extremely, extremely moving. And so I think I'm getting to the place where I am circling back and going to the place of origin where the stories begin. I think that's it.
Gracias, Pepón. Thank you.
Gracias. You're welcome.
Thank you so much, Pepón. Do we have time for a couple of comments? About 5 minutes. So, Pepón, I'm so struck by the ways in which your presentation connects so beautifully with what Lizania and Janelle have shared. And I'm struck by a concept that I believe you brought up when we had our sort of preparatory conversation, which was the issue of the residue. And so again, it's more a comment than a direct question, but I want to invite you to help us think about how stories are residues. And it's I think, a really important way of reconceptualizing what archives are and which the authoritative story is. And what is so beautiful about your work is the intimacy, the ethic, and the empathy that you bring to it. And I think it just comes through in such extraordinary ways in this project that you've done. So I just wanted to sort of offer that because I remember you mentioning residue.
Yeah, I think that in many ways I'm interested in two things, and they're very, very different: compassion and empathy. And I want the viewer to be able to look at the work. And sometimes what happens is that the majority of the people, when it's set in a museum, when it's seen in a museum, they're fascinated by the object. They're fascinated by what they see in front of them. And I always see that the installation, it's somehow a debris of the process. It's what what is left of the project. So my work actually starts with the process and the telling of the stories, and then it moves on to the translation of it with a visual element. But in majority of the time, people look at the ladder at the end of that process with the installation, and not so much how and what led to that place. I hope that makes sense.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I think that the, I mean, every great artist, I think, hints at, without being didactic. And in your case, I love the different scales that are present here, that big bottle of pills. I can see that is based on I'm presuming conversations that you were having with the other patients, and how ubiquitous perhaps pills are in patients' lives, and how that perception of it's all around us, it's every day, it's constant, it's many different types of pills. You're making it large, it's a Klaus Oldenburg sort of gesture of making it huge, and the walker too. And so I love these hints where you don't have to tell us, but we can see it in the objects.
Right. Thank you. Thank you. I have to tell you a story at the very end. A week before the installation, there was a group of people. I go a lot when the installations are on in the community. I go a lot and spend time because it's important to me to see where people are coming from. And so there's a group of people that it just kept coming back, and I'm like, there they are again, watching. By the way, the docents for the exhibition for convalescents were the same people that participated in the installation before, called Reform. And so I asked them if they were willing to go, to be the docent for this installation, because they knew about the process more than anyone else. And so we're standing there, and I'm going like, yeah, I see it. And the security guard for the building comes over and tells me, do you want to go out? And I'm like, yeah, I'll go out and talk to them. And I went out and talked to them. And I said, I've seen you coming around a couple of times. You want to come in? And I'll take you. I'm the artist. And we're like, oh, yeah, we'll come in. We sat at the door. And two of them said, oh, we didn't ever come in because I thought that those people were alive. And I am saying, oh, what do you mean? I was like, I thought those people were real. And so I love that interaction, that possibility that people look at the installation and they're afraid of the installation itself because of the topic, but also there's a lot of other elements that for the audience is unreal. And for me, that's where it feeds the lifespan and the value of the installation itself.
Thank you, Pepón.
Thank you.
It's been wonderful. I want to just, we might have time for a question from the audience, but I also wanted to acknowledge, the other artists, if they want to ask each other questions. Because of our technical issues at the beginning, we don't have a lot of time, unfortunately, but just putting it out there. Or
Can I ask a quick question?
Go ahead, Pepón.
Yeah.
To both Lizania and Janelle, I'm curious as to how did you learn to listen?
That's a great question. I actually, I think I learned to listen when I started meditating. And kind of through a meditation practice of being silent with myself in order to be present with others. And I think there's I did oral history workshops with Paulo Oliveira school. I kind of come from that training, but I think I was hearing a lot of things, but I was never an active listener until I gain a meditation practice daily. So
Thank you.
Thank you. For me, I think I learned to listen even as a young child, I was really quiet and shy, but very observant, and just kind of learned to listen to people talking and telling stories, and I would remember everything. But I didn't necessarily respond all the time. And so when I became an adult, the listening just kind of continued. And in terms of the work, I'm just always interested in the personal anecdotes, especially when it comes to stories that involve really large communities, because even though the experience is collective, the individual viewpoint is very unique. And so I love hearing that. I've had, community circle, like as programming for part of some of the exhibitions I showed, I would invite the neighborhood to come in for like a sharing circle. We had pan dulce and we had coffee and we sat in a circle in front of like the big cotton mural, with all this artwork that invokes the memory, that triggers the memory, and then it just went from there. And it's beautiful, just to sit back and really listen, to hear all of that.
I guess I have maybe a question too for both of you, because I think that, and it's something that we spoke about in kind of like our prep meeting as well. Sort of, and Pepón, something that you mentioned today that struck me. Usually when I do actions, when I go on the streets, I do solicit people on the street often, and I have to take like kind of a few days back for myself. There's kind of like I feel exhausted on this process, and then kind of there's like another level of, for me lately, I've been inserting myself in the work as sort of like a detective, but like that is performing this task. So, but I do insert myself, and I've been trying to figure out ways in which I could insert my family history into the work as well, because that's sort of like the kernel of why I started to do this project. But I'm curious of what are you guys' practices, because we are working and carrying these stories, right? What's kind of like the practice, and I don't mean cleansing in like a bad way, but kind of like restoring your energy after doing this energy work, after the work. And Pepón, you mentioned that, you do work like every 3 years, like it takes a long time. And Janelle, I don't know what you do, like, especially like you're very closely dealing with like your family history. But that's something that I struggle, that I don't necessarily have a good practice on yet.
Do you want to go ahead, Pepón?
I basically wanted to answer, because this is a methodology that I've used that moves me away from the instigator, or takes me away from like trying to find out, and it's for everything that I've been told, I tell my story back to the person that I'm talking to. And so I just asked you the question, Lizania and Janelle, about how did you learn to listen? And I'm going to answer that by just sharing and circling back that it's not that I'm asking you, but I'm also contributing to what you just said, both of you. And for me, I listen when I realized that things mattered, and I realized the urgency in which people were living, and immediately associated, and I saw myself there, and that's when I began to listen very, very carefully, just to make sure that that it was done properly. And I'm not talking about the installation. I'm losing words, but that I was responding properly to that. And that's not only for installation. That talks to, with my kids. That's like with my wife, Marianne. That's like with everyone that comes around, that I'm seeing the urgency in life, and I just have to listen. It's that. But to answer your question, for me, the way that I debrief, the way that I let go, it's by spending a lot of times with the families, and protecting myself after that. you know, and not that I feel threatened, but protecting myself in the sense that I have to do self-care, in order to move on, and also put some time in between where I can really let go before I move on to a new work or a new story.
Yeah,
I hope that makes.
it does. It does make sense. It's really valid because it sounds like y'all are talking about closure because
Yeah.
you're sort of opening these boxes of really, really intense emotion and histories that are, and they're personal. I mean, you're talking to people, you know, and they're sharing, they're being vulnerable in a space. And whenever you have that vulnerability, you have to find some kind of closure, whether it's sort of
Exactly.
having some time to yourself, meditating, visiting with family, and just kind of not thinking about the work aspect anymore. Just like letting that go and finding some. And I think I kind of do the same thing when, you know, a lot of my work honestly is kind of solo. Like I'm just in the studio weaving. It takes a very long time and building the things up. And then the research part is sort of like the talking to people, the reading and things like that. And so once the project is sort of finished, however long it takes, there is like a little period of closure that exists, and it's a little different every time, but it's necessary.
Right. I, Losani, I'm sorry. I have just to say this one little tiny thing. It's
No,
that
please.
the people that I work with, and that we spend time together are 100% aware that this is going to turn into an installation.
Yeah,
It's not like
same.
I'm talking about stories and they don't. No, no. This is going to turn into an installation. About what? I don't know. It's going to be an installation. So they're aware that I am looking at art as a vehicle to tell their stories.
Yeah.
I'm scanning the room because it's past 5:30, and I mean, this wouldn't be an excess intersection panel if we didn't go over. And we've done it, people, yay. So, but we have one question from the audience. Yes, can someone's gonna bring the microphone.
This is a question for the three artists, but in particular also for Pepón. When you have, you know, what happens to convalescence? What happens to your installations after?
Talking about archives, right?
Nervous laugh.
I'll be really, really quick because I wanted to hear what others have to say. I have a big storage problem, and my work ends up in my studio unless it's acquired by museums, and some museums have been willing to do that. I document my work. I document the process. I document every single thing that you can possibly imagine. As careless as I might look, I am extremely, extremely careful with the way that I document the work. The most wonderful thing, I had a recent exhibition, and the most wonderful thing is that all the museums where the work was collected, they did it on their own. They did it themselves with all the information that they have. And it gets bigger because I also buy two of everything. Anything that you see on a 99-cent store goes away faster than it does in Saks Fifth Avenue. So if anything happens to an object, I have to go back and replace it, so I'll buy two of everything.
Do either of you want to answer? I think we have one other question, but wait, hold on for the microphone. Queenie.
It's a question for all three. What stimulated me was as any of us who have done archival work know, there are gaps. And sometimes filling in those gaps is looking at other places and bringing things together. But what we can't escape is that we bring our point of view. I mean, it's a given. So when you complete one of your installations, is it an invitation for people who come to view it to continue the process that you used as you were doing your installation, that they take from it and then maybe go to other sources for their own, they don't necessarily have to do an installation, but a curiosity that then is stimulated so that they continue to ask questions about themselves and their place. And
Yeah, totally. I think 100%. So one aspect of the investigation that I didn't share is that I don't know when, maybe in 5 years, 10 years, but I imagine the closure of this project being a performance that is like an actual mock-up trial. So for every time I present this work, there's like an aspect. I created this app with a creative technologist that you could apply to be a civilian reviewer to the trial in the future. And there's like a series of questions that go along with the work, and then there's a printout that tells you if you qualify or not. And it's based sometimes on data. I also gather a lot of data, and sometimes is based on different knowledge of histories. And I do want people to continue inquiry. That's kind of like one of my motivations of doing work. Like, why don't we question the American dream more? Why don't we question these ideas of how do we relate to migration and nation and borders more often than we don't? So I hope that there's like an inquiry part of like whoever's looking at the work, because that's like a different, I think about that audience differently.
Yeah, and that makes sense, you know, for your work. You are building an archive, like you are filling in a gap, you know, to those missed histories. And I think for my work, inquiry is more aligned with kind of, you know, I was saying how the histories aren't really taught in school, but they exist all around us, and they exist in our homes and our family sort of individual, you know, circle. But I think the goal for me is more inquiry and connectivity to show that we all are a part of this big thing, not just in Texas, but nationally and even globally through the history of fiber and cotton.
Pepón, I don't know if you want to say something.
Quickly wanted to say that empathy and compassion plays a big role in looking at my work, and I never underestimate the memory, the landscape of memory that we have as a final depository of our archives. There is something in having it in a place, the physical space, but there's something different when you hit compassion and empathy, that it somehow builds and it moves into your memory. And that's extremely, extremely important for me.
That was really beautiful. We have one more slide, which is just to thank everyone for being here. Thank you for the most amazing co-moderator, Adriana, you're the best. Thank you to US LAF, US Latinx Art Forum, Mary, Sonia, Babilla, Colectivo Babilla, thank you for the live interpretation, for the live captioners, thank you so much. Jenelle, Lizania, Pepón, I mean, you're the greatest. And we're gonna bring down the slide, but I want everyone to look at the cameras and say a big hi to Pepón, because poor Pepón couldn't see anyone. And Pepón, we lost some people, but it's been really well attended. Just wanted to say. Okay,
no,
can we bring down the show?
Sending love.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.